The A-4E Skyhawk aircraft flew low toward the designated target area. U.S. Navy pilot John McCain maintained a steady course over North Vietnam. The aircraft was part of a larger bombing formation. Ground defense units fired anti-aircraft artillery and launched surface-to-air missiles. A single missile tracked toward his aircraft. The missile struck the aircraft's starboard wing. The force of the impact was immense. The plane immediately lost control and began to spin toward the ground. Smoke and noise filled the small cockpit space. The controls were unresponsive. McCain initiated the ejection sequence. The ejection seat fired him from the destroyed aircraft. The violent launch broke his right arm in 3 places. The force also caused severe damage to his shoulder and knee. He descended under the parachute canopy. He landed in the waters of Truc Bac Lake in central Hanoi. The impact with the water jarred his body further, causing intense pain. He struggled with the tangle of parachute shroud lines. A crowd of civilians and soldiers immediately gathered on the lake bank. They rushed into the shallow water toward him. They dragged his injured body out of the water. They moved him onto the dirt bank. The crowd immediately stripped him of his flight suit. They shouted at him. Soldiers and civilians kicked his body. One soldier used the butt of his rifle to strike his shoulder. The pain was immediate and blinding. A North Vietnamese soldier applied crude ropes to bind his wrists tightly behind his back. The soldier forced him to stand. He attempted to bear weight on his shattered knee. The effort caused his leg to buckle. They forced him to walk under immense pain. He was dragged through the city streets by the soldiers. The crowd continued to observe the movement. The guards transported him to a prison facility, later known to the American prisoners as the Hanoi Hilton. They shoved him into a detention cell. The door was steel and heavy. He fell onto the hard concrete floor. He was left alone in the small space. His right arm was grossly swollen and bleeding. His knee was useless. He received no medical attention for many hours. He waited for any response from his captors. He attempted to shift his weight to a more stable position. He failed due to the extremity of his injuries. The time passed slowly with no relief. He lay on the floor and focused on maintaining consciousness. The door remained shut. The cell was dark and small. Days passed with John McCain receiving no professional medical care. The pain from his broken arm and knee was constant and severe. The guards provided minimal food and water. They moved him intermittently for brief non-medical inspections. His physical condition deteriorated rapidly. The lack of proper setting for his bones caused his injuries to worsen. After 3 days, the cell door opened. 2 guards entered and pulled him from the floor. They handled his injured body roughly. They dragged him through the Sasabar corridor. The movement caused his injured limbs to scrape against the floor and walls. They pushed him into a different room. The room was sparsely furnished with a wooden table and several chairs. A senior North Vietnamese Army officer sat at the table. The officer began the interrogation. The officer told McCain that his identity was known to the High Command. The officer stated that they knew he was the son of Admiral John S. McCain, Jr., Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Command. The officer emphasized the political significance of his capture. The officer demanded that McCain provide sensitive military information. The officer requested details on the flight operations, the names of other pilots in his squadron, and the operational capacity of his aircraft carrier. The officer said cooperation would lead to better treatment. McCain replied that he was only authorized by the Code of Conduct to provide his name, rank, and serial number. He recited the 3 required pieces of information clearly. The officer became stern. The officer reiterated the demand for military information. The officer described the severity of McCain's untreated injuries. The officer said continued non-cooperation would mean continued lack of medical care. The officer described the high fever McCain was developing. The officer said the injuries could lead to permanent crippling or death. The officer said the information demanded was minor compared to the cost of continued refusal. McCain repeated that he would provide no further information. He said he would not violate the Code of Conduct. The officer warned him about the consequences of disobeying the officer's direct command. The officer said they had means to make him cooperate. The officer said his background as an admiral's son meant they would not treat him like an ordinary prisoner if he remained defiant. The officer ordered the guards to prepare the cell for isolation. McCain realized the interrogation was not about intelligence, but about breaking his will and using his name. He prepared for the impending pressure. The officer left the room. The officer returned the next day. The interrogation continued, but the tone had shifted from demands to persuasion. The officer began the discussion by describing the prestige of McCain's family. The officer said the North Vietnamese government was aware of the high political value of his capture. The officer presented a specific offer. The officer stated that due to his father's senior position, the government was prepared to offer immediate, non-conditional release. The officer said McCain would be flown directly to the United States within 48 hours. The officer said this action would be considered a major political gesture of goodwill. The officer promised that upon accepting the offer, McCain would receive immediate surgical repair for his broken arm and knee. The officer described the excellent medical facilities awaiting him. The officer emphasized the intense pain McCain was currently enduring. The officer said the acceptance of the offer was the only path to survival without permanent physical damage. McCain listened to the terms of the offer. He understood the severe violation of the code of conduct this entailed. The code stated that prisoners must be released in the order of capture, starting with the earliest captured. He knew that several hundred American prisoners were captured before him. Accepting special treatment would be used by the captors as devastating propaganda against the morale of the other prisoners. The officer pressed the point. The officer said the circumstances of war were difficult. The officer said no one would blame him for prioritizing his survival given the severity of his wounds. The officer said his continued refusal was an act of foolish, pointless defiance. The officer emphasized the speed of the transaction. McCain asked the officer if the offer included the release of all American prisoners captured before October 1967. The officer looked surprised. The officer firmly denied the request. The officer said the release was for McCain only. The officer stated that the terms were not negotiable and the offer was time-sensitive. The officer warned that if he waited too long, the offer would be retracted and the extreme punishment would commence. McCain focused on the principle. He thought about the men he knew were suffering in nearby cells. He calculated the damage his political release would cause to their continued resistance. He knew his duty was to the chain of command and the other prisoners. He made his decision. He waited for the officer to stop speaking. He prepared his final response. John McCain looked at the officer and delivered his reply. He told the officer he would not accept the offer of early release. He stated clearly that he would not leave the prison before every American prisoner who had been captured before him was also released. He said he would not be used for enemy propaganda. The officer's demeanor hardened instantly. The officer shouted at McCain. The officer demanded to know if he understood the magnitude of his refusal. The officer stated that McCain was condemning himself to years of severe treatment and possibly death. The officer told him he was acting against his own best interest and against the wishes of his government. McCain repeated his position. He said his commitment was to the code of conduct and the integrity of the prisoner command structure. The officer immediately withdrew the offer of medical care. The officer signaled the guards to begin the punishment. The guards immediately subjected McCain to physical torture. They bound his arms with ropes using a technique known as the rope trick. The ropes were tightened to put maximum pressure on his shoulders and elbow joints. The severe pressure immediately exacerbated the injuries to his right arm and shoulder. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. The interrogator repeated the demands for military information. The interrogator asked for the flight schedule of his carrier air wing. McCain fought the pain. He maintained his stance. He gave only his name, rank, and serial number. The guards increased the tension on the ropes. The torture continued for several hours. The interrogator continually offered relief in exchange for a simple propaganda statement or the requested information. McCain remained silent except for involuntary cries of pain. He focused on withholding any statement that could be used for political gain or military intelligence. The guards beat him severely. They inflicted further damage to his body. After the session, the guards left him on the floor of the cell. His body was severely damaged. He was weak from the pain and exhaustion. He knew the refusal of early release had resulted in the immediate commencement of extreme punishment. He understood that his resistance had now entered a new, more brutal phase. He lay on the floor and waited for the next interrogation. The punishment continued relentlessly for weeks. John McCain was kept in isolation. He was subjected to frequent torture sessions. The guards used ropes, beatings, and sleep deprivation. His injuries worsened due to the constant abuse and the continued lack of medical care. He lost a substantial amount of weight. His physical health declined to a critical level. The camp commandant decided to increase the psychological pressure. They kept him in deep isolation for many weeks, with no contact with any other human being except the guards. The lack of sensory input and human communication began to break his mental resistance. He struggled to remember the faces of his family and the details of his life. The interrogator returned and presented a final demand. The interrogator stated that if McCain would write and sign a short, simple statement admitting he was a black criminal and apologizing for his actions, the torture would stop. The interrogator emphasized that the statement would be used only internally and would not be broadcast. The interrogator said that further resistance would result in his death. McCain thought about the consequence. He knew his body could not withstand further physical pressure. The isolation had already severely compromised his mental clarity. He was convinced that he was near death. He knew that the code of conduct required him to resist until he could resist no longer. He agreed to write a statement. He was given a pen and paper. He wrote a confession that was heavily garbled and filled with awkward phrasing, clearly indicating it was coerced. He wrote, "I am a black criminal and I have performed air crimes and I apologize for my crimes." He intentionally misspelled several words and used unnatural language. He signed the confession. The act of writing the statement immediately released the physical pressure. The guards immediately stopped the torture and provided him with minimal medical attention and food. He knew he had broken the code of conduct even under duress. The guilt from the concession was immediate and profound. He recognized the success of the captor's psychological strategy. He was returned to a smaller, slightly cleaner cell, but remained in isolation. He knew he had reached his absolute breaking point under the combination of physical pain and total isolation. He resolved that he would never again make a statement, regardless of the consequences. After the coerced confession, John McCain was kept in isolation for several more months. His health slowly stabilized due to the minimal care. He focused on regaining his mental strength. The prison command then moved him from isolation into a communal cell with two other American prisoners, Major Bud Day and Lieutenant Commander Mike McGrath. The contact with fellow soldiers was an immediate psychological restoration. The other prisoners immediately initiated communication. They taught McCain the prisoner tap code, a system based on a 5x5 letter matrix. The men used small, rapid taps on the cell walls or floors to spell out messages. They communicated the code and operational details of the prison to McCain. McCain immediately committed to rebuilding his participation in the prisoner command structure. He used the tap code to share details of his interrogation and the tactics used by the guards. He learned the names of the other American prisoners in adjacent cells. He learned the date of capture of the most senior officers. The communication network provided vital psychological support and maintained the discipline of the code of conduct. The camp authorities occasionally permitted the prisoners to write personal letters home. The letters were heavily censored by the guards. The prisoners, including McCain, used the letters to send covert intelligence back to the United States military. They developed a subtle coding system based on intentionally using awkward phrases, unusual grammar, or slightly incorrect information that would signal the truth to military intelligence analysts. McCain wrote a letter to his wife. He wrote about his medical condition in specific technical language that was slightly incorrect, signaling the reality of his injuries. He embedded the initials of two newly captured high-value prisoners into the text using a sequence of benign words. He wrote about the health of the other men in his cell in a pattern that confirmed the tap code was fully operational. He submitted the letter to the censor. The letter was used for North Vietnamese propaganda showing a healthy writing prisoner. McCain knew the letter's true purpose was achieved in the coded phrases. The communication, both internal through the tap code and external through the letters, was the foundation of the prisoner's moral survival. The men reinforced the discipline of the code daily through the shared understanding of the code. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973. The prisoners of war were scheduled for release in phases. John McCain was part of the final wave of released prisoners, reflecting the duration of his capture. He was severely thin and walked with a visible limp due to his improperly set knee. He was transported with the other released prisoners to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Upon arrival, he was immediately greeted by U.S. military officials and an immense media presence. The public saw him as a symbol of endurance. A senior military officer met him on the tarmac. The officer requested that McCain make a short, positive statement for the press. McCain immediately refused to make any public comment. He stated that he would not speak to the media until he had received a full medical checkup and completed his military debriefing. He maintained the discipline of the Code of Conduct even upon his release. He underwent immediate, comprehensive medical examinations. The doctors documented the severity of his permanent physical injuries, including the damage to his arms, knee, and spine. He then entered the official military debriefing. He provided a detailed factual account of his capture and imprisonment. He confirmed the methods of torture used, the names of the guards, and the severe conditions of the isolation cells. He discussed the TAP code and the successful prisoner command structure maintained throughout the camp. He specifically told the debriefing officer about the times he had broken under extreme pressure, including the coerced propaganda statement. He stated that every man has a breaking point, and he had reached his. He emphasized that the critical success was his refusal of the early release offer, which preserved the morale and structure of the entire prison population. He stated that the political value of his refusal was greater than any military intelligence he might have withheld. The debriefing officer recorded his statement fully. The officer assured him that his actions were fully consistent with the code of conduct given the duress. McCain accepted the medical care and began the long process of physical and psychological recovery. He knew the public saw a hero, but he recognized the moral compromise and physical cost of his survival. He returned to the United States to continue his recovery. Decades after his release, John McCain served as a U.S. Senator. He became a senior member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. His experience in the prison camp continued to define his political decisions regarding military and intelligence policy. Following the events of September 11, 2001, the U.S. government debated the use of enhanced interrogation techniques against captured enemy combatants. These techniques included waterboarding, forced stress positions, and sleep deprivation. These methods were identical to the torture he had endured in North Vietnam. McCain immediately opposed the use of these techniques. He spoke publicly and forcefully against the POW policy. He stated that the methods were morally repugnant and legally unacceptable. He told his colleagues that the techniques were not enhanced interrogation, but were simply torture. He introduced legislation to legally ban the use of these techniques by all U.S. agencies, including the military and intelligence services. He used his personal history as factual evidence in the debate. He told his fellow senators that the information acquired under torture was unreliable and tainted. He stated that a subject under duress would say anything to stop the pain, regardless of the truth. He warned that the use of torture compromised the moral character of the United States. He said that if the U.S. adopted the methods of its enemies, it would lose the moral authority to lead the world. He insisted that American principles must remain constant even in wartime. He successfully campaigned for the passage of the Detainee Treatment Act in 2005. The legislation prohibited the inhumane treatment of detainees in U.S. custody. His personal refusal to accept torture as a legal option became a defining moral principle of his political career. He maintained that his survival in the prison camp was not a justification for the use of torture, but a demonstration of why it must be banned. He often repeated that the greatest defense of American values was adherence to its principles, not the use of brutal methods. His personal moral integrity, forged during his time as a prisoner, ultimately shaped national security policy for years to come.